Just like we just talked about, a quadrilateral is a shape with 4 sides. So the last lesson we did like this was about triangles. And so we talked about how you can classify triangles in 2 ways. You can classify triangles by the length of their sides, and then you can give it a second name that's based on the measurement of its angles. And then you did some measuring with the sides, and you used a protractor to measure the angles of those triangles on Friday to try and figure out what kind of triangles those were. So today we're talking about quadrilaterals, and so there are several shapes that have 4 sides. The word quad means 4. So there's a quad that you might ride, has 4 wheels, right? 4 tires. So that, if that helps you to remember, a quadrilateral is a shape with 4 sides. So all 5 of the shapes we're going to talk about today, because I have 5 names to give you, all 5 of these shapes are all considered quadrilaterals because they have 4 sides. But they can have another name based on what those sides look like what are the lengths of those sides? What are the angles like in the shape? So we're going to talk about those things too. So there are lots of notes to take in today's math lesson. But it will be review, I hope. I hope you remember. So we're going to talk about, this is geometry. Whenever we're talking about shapes, we're talking about geometry. That's where that falls under. So we're going to talk about how that can help you solve problems in your everyday life. So depending, we talked about this on the first day we did this chapter. Depending on what your job is when you grow up, you may be using geometry to help you in your job. So let's take some notes. What are the attributes of a quadrilateral? That's the question at the top of this page. So an attribute is kind of like what makes it a quadrilateral. So what are the things that would make these shapes a quadrilateral, and how are they different from each other? Because I told you there's 5 of them. So on your paper, I need you to make a little chart, and it's going to have 3 columns. One's going to say name, another's going to say attributes, and the last one is going to have the word shape, and that's where we're going to draw the shape. So I'm going to end up running out of space, and so I'll only be able to put 1 or 2, and then I'll erase it. Most of it. You're going to need enough for 5 spaces. Yeah, that's fine. What you have? So the first name is square. Now the attributes of a square are that it has 4 right angles and 4 congruent sides. So then under the shape column, you can draw yourself a square. And we're going to mark that all of these are right angles, and we're going to mark that all of these are the same length. So remember that the word congruent means it's the same length. So we have 4 right angles, and they're congruent, right, because they're all right angles. And then we have 4 sides that are all the same length. So those little tick marks that look like a 1 on each of those mean that they are the same. So any one that has the little 1 tick mark is the same as all the other ones that have the little 1 tick mark next to it. Write down everything I write. So over here on the side, the little orange one right here, that is a square. So I know that you already knew what a square was, but sometimes we forget the definition of a square. Like we forget what makes a square, what makes it different from other shapes. Because some of these shapes are actually going to have more than 1 name, which is something else that might be a little bit different for you. So we can call this shape right here, this orange shape, we can call it a quadrilateral, and we can call it a square. Okay, so far. Here you go. Here you go, Travis. Yep. All right, next shape. Everybody have all that? Thank you. I'm going to have to erase mine so that I can fit everything in here. Next shape is a rectangle. And the attributes of a rectangle, so under your attribute column, mine's going to look a little different than yours so I can fit more information here. I want to write it big enough so you can see it. The attributes of a rectangle are 4 right angles, just like a square. So that makes it similar to a square, that it has 4 right angles. But the difference is the opposite sides are congruent and parallel. All 4 are not the same, okay? So opposite sides are congruent and parallel. And there's the vocab word parallel that we want to make sure we add to our notes as well. Parallel lines are 2 lines that never cross each other. They never intersect. So you can think of parallel lines like the tracks on a railroad track. So the tracks on the railroad track, they're always going to go straight, like one is never going to veer in towards the other one. Okay, so parallel means they are running in the same direction, never going to touch each other. So if I'm drawing 2 maybe like outside of your little chart that you've created, you should draw a little picture of what parallel means, because we're going to be using that term a lot. So parallel lines can run this way or this way, and it means they never touch each other.
Can't they run the other way?
Oh, they can run this way. Yeah. Any direction, really. They just have to be 2 lines that will never touch. So parallel lines never intersect. So now I'm going to show you an example of a rectangle. I'm going to draw one here. So under your, where it says shape, you need to draw a picture of a rectangle. 4 right angles. And then I'm going to draw 1 mark on those 2 ends, because these two sides to that rectangle are congruent and parallel. And these 2 sides are congruent and parallel. So I drew little 2 tick marks on those ones. So the 1, that means that any that have a 1 on them are the same, and any that have a 2 on them are the same. Okay, that's what those little lines mean. Because I didn't draw that shape using a ruler. It's not a perfect rectangle, I just freehanded it. So it's nice to put those little marks in there just so that if anybody's looking at it, you know that which ones are supposed to be the same, even though they might not look the same up here because it was just a drawing that I did without a ruler. Okay? So a rectangle, this shape right here, can be called a quadrilateral because it has 4 sides, and it can be called a rectangle because it has 4 right angles and it has 2 opposite sides that are congruent and parallel with each other. Does that make sense? So a shape that looks like this can be called a rectangle, and it can also be called a quadrilateral. Okay? Make sure you have the attributes. Those are important, because when we go through all of these shapes, some that you might not think could actually be called by more than one name. And if you don't have the attributes written down, it's hard to tell. So I'm going to give you an example of that before I show you what the next one is. If I show you this shape, I'm going to erase this now. This shape over here. Can I call this a quadrilateral?
Yes.
Can I call it a square?
Yes.
Can I call it a rectangle?
No.
Think again. Can I call that a rectangle? Yes. Someone tell me what are the attributes. Just tell me what are the attributes of a rectangle. What is an attribute of a rectangle?
I remember that.
Just one.
2 sets of parallel lines.
2 sets of opposite parallel lines, right? The sides that are opposite of each other have to be parallel and congruent. So this side and this side, those are parallel and congruent. This side and this side, also parallel and congruent. They just happen to all 4 be parallel, like not parallel. They all four happen to be congruent. So a square, not all of them. It's not all of them. But a square actually can be called several of these names once we get started with the attributes. So on your test or on your proficiency, if they show you a picture of a square like this one, it might say, give all the names that apply to this shape. And a lot of people are just going to write square and move on. You would get it wrong if you did that, because you could call it a quadrilateral, you could call it a square, and at this point you could also call it a rectangle. And there's going to be more names you could give that shape too once we get through a little bit more. Go ahead and test. All right, oops. I'm trying to drag it back. See? Exactly. Watch. I have to turn my pen off first. There we go. All right, here's another one. The third shape is called a rhombus.
A diagram.
Just write it. Rhombus. Here are the attributes of a rhombus. Now you need to write this down because this is how we're going to be able to tell what all the other shapes are called, okay? Because some shapes can also be called a rhombus, but if you don't, it's not always going to look like the rhombus. That is not always going to look like this. That's an example of a rhombus. But every time you see one, it's not going to look exactly like that. It could look different. So here's the attributes of a rhombus. 4 congruent sides that are parallel. Four congruent sides. Let me write this a little bit differently. 4 congruent sides, opposites are parallel. So this one right here is a rhombus too. It's the only difference is that the lines are more slanted, right? The angle measures are different. So all of the lengths of these sides are the same. This is a square that has all congruent sides. This one is it's a square that's been like tilted to the side. So it's a square minus the right angles, right? So all the sides are the same. The opposite sides are parallel. But a rhombus is where they do not have 90-degree angles. So they could have a variance of angles. It's just a slanted square. So something that you should know about a rhombus is that the opposite angles are congruent. So the opposite sides are parallel, but the opposite angles are congruent. So write that down too. And I'll show you what that means. So if I draw a picture, I wanted a bigger one. So this angle and this angle are the same. Notice I put the little tick marks there over the little angle mark. Then this angle and this angle are the same. So that's something else that you can know when you talk about quadrilaterals. So if I told you, like sometimes like on your test, you might see something where they say, this angle measure right here is 110 degrees. What is this angle measure? 110 degrees, because I told you that they're the same, right? When it's opposite of each other, like they're across the shape from each other, those are opposite angles and they are always going to be equal on a quadrilateral. That's a rhombus. Okay, so opposite angles are congruent as well. So those are some different examples of rhombuses. These two are slanted this direction. The one I drew was slanted the other direction. Sometimes they can just be very, like almost not even slanted at all, and that's still a rhombus. They can be super slanted, kind of like this brown one, and still be considered a rhombus. So this shape could be considered a quadrilateral. Can it be a square?
Yes. Yes. No. No.
What makes it not a square? What's the thing that makes it not a square? Angelina. So that changes the angle measures, right? Because it's shifted, it changes the angle measures. Because to be a square, it has to have 90-degree angles, right? And this one doesn't. Can it be called a rectangle? Why not, Carnpreet?
It's tilted.
It's tilted, so again, it has to have to be a rectangle, it has to have 4 right angles. This one doesn't have 4 right angles. The opposite sides are parallel and congruent, but it doesn't have right angles, so it can't be a rectangle either. So this shape could be, so far, a quadrilateral and a rhombus. Nolan.
Also, here's another tip. All quadrilaterals, their angles equal 360.
I was getting there. Haven't been there yet. I'm just doing the shapes first. And then we will write that into our notes, though. All right, number 4 is a parallelogram. So just like it sounds, it has some parallel lines, right? So it kind of is like a rhombus in that it doesn't have to have right angles, but it's more like a rectangle shape. So you have opposite sides that are congruent and parallel in a parallelogram, not all 4. So a rhombus is related to a square because all 4 sides are the same length, and a parallelogram is related to a rectangle because it has opposite sides are the same. Doesn't have to have 4 right angles, but opposite angles are congruent. That's an and symbol. Oops. So if I'm drawing a parallelogram, I'm going to start out with some longer lines. Oh, that's bad. Let me fix the bottom. It's just going to look like a rectangle that's been slanted. So those 2 ends are going to be the same, and then the 2 long pieces are going to be the same. And then the opposite angles of each other will also be congruent. So the angle down here will measure the same as the angle over here, and the angle here will be the same as the angle down there. So it's like a rectangle that's been slanted to the side, one side or another side. Yeah.
Also, by the way, there's some other names for the square too.
There is. I was going to do it when we were finished. I didn't want to. I hadn't showed you what they were yet.
Too far ahead.
Okay, last one is a trapezoid. And this one is different than all the others. So a trapezoid, so like a lot of the shapes can be called by other names. A trapezoid is only going to be a trapezoid and a quadrilateral. It's never going to be anything else because it can only have one pair of parallel sides. Because if I didn't write exactly, then if it just said one pair of parallel sides, a square, a rectangle, and a rhombus, and a parallelogram all have one pair of parallel sides, but they have also another one. They have 2 pairs of parallel sides. A trapezoid can only have one pair of parallel sides. So here is an example of a trapezoid. This is how you see them a lot, this red shape. But they can also, the red shape up here that I just drug up here, it can also look like this. Sometimes you see them that way. Sometimes you see them upside down, like that. So here's what I mean by one pair of parallel sides. The top and the bottom are parallel to each other on this red shape. The top and the bottom are parallel to each other. They're not the same length. It didn't say that they have to be congruent. It just says they have to be parallel, which means that they'll continue going and going and never touch each other. Do you see how the sides are slanted inwards? They're not currently touching each other, but if you were to extend those lines, eventually they would cross. And so those 2 sides cannot be parallel lines. Same thing with the one I drew like this that stands on its end. You have these 2 sides that are parallel, this long side and this shorter side over here. Then the bottom is flat, But this one, if you extended this line, eventually it would overrun the bottom line. So it can only have one pair of parallel lines, not two. It can be, they have to be two that are running next to each other. Yes, you have to remember what parallel means. All right, so now I'm going to see if you wrote down all those attributes. If you talk instead of write, then you're always going to be behind. So I'm going to put up some shapes, and I'm going to ask you to tell me a name that you could give that shape, okay? Kind of like what we did already with the square and the rectangle. But now we've learned a couple more names that you could probably call some of those shapes. So let's do a couple of those. Can I call, let's see. What are some names I could give this shape? Let's start again. Raise your hand if you know one name. Look at your attributes that we wrote down. What's one name you can give that shape, Amy? A quadrilateral is one. Hamza, what's another name? A square. Another name? You could call it a rectangle. What else could you call it?
Parallelogram.
You could call it a parallelogram, because in order to be a parallelogram, look at your notes. Opposite sides are congruent and parallel, and that's how it is in this shape. What else can it be called?
A shape.
No, that's not one of the names that I gave you today. What else?
A rhombus?
It can be called a rhombus. Listen. The attributes of a rhombus are two opposite, like all four sides are congruent and the two opposite sides are parallel, which is how it is in this shape. Now this one, it's like a bonus because it has four right angles. That's why it's a square. But in order to be a rhombus, it doesn't have to have right angles. So it could also be called a rhombus. So actually this orange shape up here can be called 5 different names. Quadrilateral, square, rectangle, parallelogram, rhombus. The only name that it can't be called is a trapezoid, out of all the names that we learned today. Okay? So when you take your test, like your math proficiency, no. That's not one of the shapes that we use. So on your math proficiency, it's going to have a list of all kinds of names, and it's going to say, what are the names that you could give this shape? And if all you mark is square, you will get it wrong, because you have to mark all of the names that you could give that shape, not just one name. So you'd have to go through all of the shapes and see which ones how this would qualify as that type of shape. What about this shape? What are some names I could give this shape?
Rhombus.
Raise your hand if you know of a name I could give this shape. Nolan.
Diamond. No, I'm kidding. Rhombus.
You could call it a rhombus. Hamza, what else? You could call it a parallelogram. Catherine. A quadrilateral. Can it be called a square?
No.
No, because there's no right angles. Can't be called a rectangle because no right angles. Can't be called a trapezoid because there's more than one pair of parallel sides. This has 2 sets of parallel sides, and a trapezoid can only have one. So if we're reading about, this has a shape. Do you see all the little lines? They're showing you what things can be called besides just its one name. So whenever you see a shape, generally we have one name that we like to give that shape. Hold on. Usually we have one name that we like to give that shape, but on this lesson, this is why you have to really be looking at all the attributes that you wrote down to find out what other names it can be given as well. So if we start up here at the top, this is a 4-sided shape that the only name it can be called is a quadrilateral because it has 4 sides and it doesn't follow any of the rules of the other 5 shapes that we learned about today. So the only thing it can be called is a quadrilateral. Over here is this shape that's called a trapezoid. It's a quadrilateral with exactly 1 pair of opposite sides that are parallel. So you need to fill in with the number 1. Now if you go down from the quadrilateral shape right here, you get to this shape, which is called a parallelogram. It's a quadrilateral with opposite sides, congruent, and what? What will I write on that line? Parallel. Now, do you see how the parallelogram is also connected to the rectangle? It's also connected to the rhombus. It's also connected to, like, all of these are connected because the rectangle, like, you can call them different things. Like, the rectangle can be called a parallelogram. A rhombus can be called a parallelogram. So they kind of are linked together in such a way. So if you have, let's go to the bottom right here. This shape here, a rhombus, is a parallelogram with how many sides congruent? How many sides must be congruent, Angelina? 4. All 4 sides must be congruent in order to call it a rhombus. What about a square? A parallelogram with blank sides congruent and blank right angles. What number will I write in there? Hamza. 4. 4 and 4. Because all 4 sides have to be congruent and all 4 angles have to be right angles. Now to be a rectangle is a parallelogram with how many right angles? Turn 3. 4. So part of your assignment today, there's just going to be some pictures of shapes. And it will say, list all the names that you could give this shape. Or what are all the names, what are all the ways you could classify this shape? What are all the names for it? And you have to list them all if you want to get full credit. Okay? Let's look at the next example. This one says, yours, I think your picture is a little different than mine. One side of a building is shown at the right. Describe the attributes of the quadrilateral and then classify it based on its attributes. So we're looking at the red line on the picture of the building. So the quadrilateral has opposite sides blank and blank. The opposite sides of that are congruent and parallel, right? Because we have this side and this side are the same. This side and this side are the same. So they are opposite sides are parallel and congruent. You could say congruent and parallel as well. Oh yeah. You'll have to sharpen it. Your picture is a little different than mine. Mine makes it look more like a rectangle. If you like tilted the picture a little bit. Yours definitely does not have right angles. Like mine look close, like they could possibly be right angles, but yours definitely does not. So since there's no right angles, how would you classify this shape? What would you call it? What's something that you might call this shape, Aiden? Well, no. To be considered a rhombus, all the sides have to be the same, and those ones don't have all sides the same. Ava. This one doesn't have right angles. Has to have right angles to be a rectangle. Hamza. You could call it a quadrilateral.
Do we have to write that, or only just one?
Well, they actually say describe the attributes of the quadrilateral. So what else could it be called, Ashley?
It could be called a parallelogram.
Parallelogram. So that shape can only be called a parallelogram or a quadrilateral. Like I said, my shape looks almost like it could be a rectangle, like those could be right angles. Yours definitely doesn't. So in order to get full credit on your assignment today, you have to write the name of all the names that the shape can be given, not just one. So if you only wrote quadrilateral on this shape, you couldn't get full credit because you'd have to have quadrilateral and parallelogram. Yes. in order to get full credit. You have to have them both. Just like on the test, if you only mark one of the names, it won't give you credit for that. You have to mark them all. Okay, so pay very close attention to the directions. The directions will change throughout the assignment. So just make sure that you look.
It says the quadrilateral.